Hi, uh, my name is Ed Steher, and I'm the president of the National Foundation of Swallowing Disorders. I'm also a head and neck cancer survivor and was diagnosed with severe dysphagia in 2007, so 11 years ago. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight or today, depending on where you are, and thank you for attending our dysphagia webinar series. I'll spend a few minutes before turning this over to our keynote speaker tonight. The Foundation's mission is to improve the lives of all those with a swallowing disorder. And we do that through providing patient support, enhancing education, increasing awareness, public, professional, government awareness of this disorder, and also promoting promising research. Just in the area of patient support, we have about a dozen swallowing support groups throughout the country. We have 2 active Facebook groups, one for a pediatric population and their caregivers, and one for an adult population. So during tonight's webinar, you will be muted, but there is there should be a blue question mark on your screen, and you can type in a question at any time, and then we'll help moderate those questions. PDFs were handed out, emailed to you for note-taking, and there are articles available for you to download on the toolbar. And before introducing tonight's speaker, I'd really like to thank Ricky Desai for volunteering to spearhead our 2018 webinar series, and also Elizabeth Lipton-Daly for managing the delivery of our webinars. We couldn't do it without all this support. Next slide, please. So I'm excited to introduce you to Dr. Christina Steele. I'll let you read the credentials, but Dr. Steele has been addressing this professionally in a leadership position for over 2 decades. In 1998, she was the president of the Canadian Speech Language Pathology and Audiology Association president. And the work that she's going to be presenting tonight, I'm excited about because it has the potential to help almost everyone with a swallowing disorder. So there's a broad application, whether you're an adult, a caregiver, a therapist, an infant, a pediatric age. The work that Dr. Steele is doing is going to help all of us. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Steele, and please remember you can submit questions at any point during her talk. So welcome, Dr. Steele. Give us a minute to get the slide put up, and
hopefully everybody can see the slides now. So good evening, everybody, or good morning or good afternoon if you're not in North America. I'd really like to thank the NFOSD for the invitation to speak tonight. It really is a huge honor, and I am really a huge fan of the work that NFOSD is doing. I'm going to be speaking tonight about the International Dysphagia Diet Standardization Initiative, which I will call IDDSI. Some people call it IDDSI, and it really doesn't matter which of those terms you use. You can see my disclosures on the slide here, and I think the important thing to mention here is that IDDSI is a volunteer group of board of directors, and the work that we do relies on funding and sponsorship from a wide variety of industry partners and other organizations. These groups are not part of the IDDSI work themselves, but we're extremely grateful for their support. So just as we launch the talk tonight, we thought we would do just a couple of audience polls, and I may need Elizabeth or Ed to guide us here, but we'd like you to tell us who you are, and you can see there are 5 options on the slide. And if you look at your GoToWebinar control panel, you can see polls there. And so if you could go to that and answer that question, as well as the second audience poll, which tells us where you're from. And we'll be able to see those results all together later as they come in. So just to start the content tonight, then we're brought here together by our interest in this condition called dysphagia. And dysphagia has different definitions to different people. For me, personally, as a speech-language pathologist, I recognize that I'm very focused on the pharynx. And I'm struck by the fact that this is a very common syndrome. You may be familiar with a recent paper that the NFOSD was involved in producing along with David Francis, who I think was the first author, that looked at the burden and economic impact of dysphagia. It's a really very significant condition, and it can be characterized, as you will all know, by the patient themselves experiencing and feeling difficulty swallowing. But for me, it has 2 major functional consequences. One is difficulty protecting the airway, leading to penetration and aspiration or choking. And the second, and often less remembered component, is efficiency and our ability to clear food and liquid through the pharynx to the esophagus. The field of dysphagia is surprisingly young. Dr. Logeman's textbook was first published in 1983, and the Dysphagia Journal followed beginning in 1986. And it's interesting to go back through the history of publications in the field and to recognize that the use of texture modification or the thickening of liquids have been with us really since the inception of our work in this area. This particular article that I'm highlighting here on the screen, I think, comes from about 1986 by Curran and Grower. It describes this approach to using diet modification to reduce the risks associated with dysphagia and specifically to reduce the risk of aspiration. This is not a research article per se, but a description of practice in a Veterans Affairs hospital at that point in time. And as a North American, it's interesting to read this article and realize that this is the first documented use of terminology that has become familiar to us in the years since, of nectar thick, honey thick, and pudding thick liquids. So I've just given you terms that have been in wide use in North America for many years and were particularly entrenched in the National Dysphagia Diet published in 2002. But if you look around the world, and even within countries, even within cities, even within hospitals, we use many different names to describe or label the texture modifications that we're recommending for people with dysphagia. This slide highlights some of that variability in naming practice from a study in Australia published in 2007. And you can see 4 thicknesses of liquid portrayed across the top of the slide. And what they discovered in that survey was that clinicians were using 39 different names for these 4 levels of liquid thickness. And when they asked a similar question about 4 different levels of texture modified food, they uncovered 95 different labels that were in practice, being used in practice at that time. So huge variety in names. But even when we use the same name, the question is, do we mean the same thing by that name? And if I call a liquid a nectar thick liquid, would you call that liquid a nectar thick liquid? And Dr. Julie Cicero, who's a colleague of mine with the IDDSI project, did a really seminal study in Australia published in 2000, which showed that when you took liquids that had the same label across different hospitals within the same city and measured their flow properties, that there were huge differences. And so we were not really using labels effectively to describe an identifiable or measurable product. And this, unfortunately, is a safety concern for people with dysphagia. Now, when I say safety concern, I really mean that we should be treating our prescriptions of diet texture modification for people with dysphagia with the same kind of respect that is used when prescribing medication for people who need medication for various health concerns. It's not hard to imagine how horrified we would be if there was a lack of precision in describing the amount of a medication that somebody needed to control something like blood pressure. This would be a major scandal in healthcare. And yet, for some reason, historically, food hasn't been considered like a medication in healthcare. And yet, for people with dysphagia, food and liquid can have similar consequences if we get it wrong. In terms of serious adverse events. It is not difficult to look through coroners' reports and find examples of situations where providing an inappropriate food texture has led to death. On this slide, I list just a few examples that are found in really recent coroners' literature from countries around the world. You can see here we have people choking to death on sandwiches, on meat, on shepherd's pie, on vegetables, on lump-sized food, and so forth. And you can also see that the ages of these people range. We have an example here of a 9-month-old child who choked to death in the United Kingdom, right up to elderly people. I think one of the things that really jumps out when you read this literature is that there are some kinds of foods that we aren't surprised to see as implicated in choking incidents. So meat, I think, is something that people recognize as a choking risk. But the one thing that is really the most common is bread. And bread, of course, varies around the world, and it's very prominent in our diets. It's also something that we frequently make exceptions for when we recommend food for people with dysphagia. We need to recognize how serious the risk of choking deaths is with bread. So concerns around clarity in communicating the precise textures that we believe are appropriate for patients with dysphagia in a way that will lead to getting the right food to that patient, right food and liquid, are the vision behind the International Dysphagia Diet Standardization Initiative. We believe this is a safety issue, and we believe that it impacts patients of all ages in all care settings and across all cultures. So in 2012, we came together for the first time as this sort of crew of passionate kindred spirits to embark on this project. Several of us had prior experience in the development of guidelines within our own countries. And yet we thought, this is bigger than any one country. Can't we do this in a bigger way that will promote safety for people with dysphagia around the world? And so this has really been the most rewarding volunteer activity I've ever had professionally, to work with this group of people. We come from, as you can see, all countries, very many countries around the world, but also different professions. We have physicians, nurses, food scientists, fluid mechanics engineers, speech pathologists, occupational therapists, physiotherapists, dietitians, and food service experts on this team. And it's the bringing together of those complementary areas of expertise that has really enabled us to move forward. The process of developing this guideline has been documented in our most recent publication in 2017, and it's shown here on this slide. But just to say that we followed a series of steps, a visioning step at the beginning. We then did a review of existing standards around the world. We did a systematic review of the research literature to try to find guidance and evidence behind what we were doing. We developed a draft framework, and we sought feedback from consumers and clinicians and industry partners at every stage of the project. And so here on this slide is illustrated the final publication in that process, the release of the actual IDDSI framework in 2017. And you can access that article at the links shown on the slide. And it's important to say that IDDSI is committed to public domain dissemination of this this work. And so wherever possible, we make all of our publications available for free through our website or through the journals where they're published. So you can see that we ended up with a framework with 8 levels from 0 to 7 in it. And the framework is organized as 2 pyramids. The left pyramid of foods goes down from level 7 to level 3. And the right-hand pyramid for drinks moves up from thin liquids to the middle to extremely thick liquids. There are a couple of sort of paradigm shifts that we encountered when we came up with this framework. And we really liked the sort of visual imagery of these 2 pyramids going from unrestricted broad ranges of texture at level 0 and 7 to a much more restricted range in the middle. But I think one of the biggest paradigm shifts that we made was to really come to the clear realization that there were texture modified foods that were being used and were being called pureed, or liquidized that had exactly the same characteristics as thickened liquids in the moderately thick and extremely thick ranges. And so you can see here that we use the same colors and the same number in the framework for those levels, but we retained different names for them. One of the reasons there was that we learned that in kitchens, it's important to classify an item as either a liquid, a drink, or a food. And we've had fun conversations about things like soup. Is that a drink or is that a food? Of course, those are sort of more nutritional decisions. So this was the framework that we came up with. And as this has been disseminated and people are talking about it, for me and for many of us on the IDDSI board of directors, it's taking another bit of a morph in our minds. None of these levels by themselves are a diet. A diet contains both a prescription of a food item and a drink item. And so I've come to think of each of these levels as components that go then into a diet prescription. And one of the things that's interesting is to realize that if we recommend, for example, pureed food and mildly thick drinks, that it's quite logical for that person also to be able to tolerate the level in between. And so that diet prescriptions are starting to take on the characterization of a range of levels from this framework. So we finished that project in 2017, and then given the huge uptake, decided to keep going into a new phase, moving towards implementation. And so in North America, the target date for implementation of the IDDSI framework is in fact next January the 1st. And you can see on the slide that there are dates targeted in April and May of next year for implementation or adoption in the United Kingdom and Australia. And there are other countries that have dates within that same sort of time frame. So what do we mean by a target date for implementation? What we mean by that is that industry partners who produce foods or liquids for people with dysphagia have committed to having labeling by that date that includes the IDDSI terminology so that it'll be clear on a product where it falls on the framework. Those labels might be dual labels. They might contain both an old label and the new IDDSI reference, or they might have transitioned completely. And so as industry moves there in its product labeling, then the rest of us in our facilities as customers of those industry products need to understand the mapping and hopefully be working on our own relabeling and reclassification of foods and liquids from our kitchens to the IDDSI framework. And so IDDSI is in the process of building and sharing a number of resources to help you with the big goal of implementation. And we've envisioned it as a process that involves stages of awareness building, such as tonight's webinar, preparing, and then adopting with a monitoring component that goes right through those layers. So just at this point, we'll take a quick break, and you could maybe go back to the poll and just let us know if IDDSI implementation has begun in your area or your facility, if you're aware of that at this point in time. So what is implementation going to look like for those of us that are more at the front line, whether that's clinicians, whether that's family members of people with dysphagia or the patients themselves, or perhaps you work more in an administrative leadership role with respect to diets in your facility or in industry. And so on this slide is slightly changed from the version in the handout. But we believe there are 6 key steps to implementation. The first is to become familiar with the website and the resources. The second very important step is to form a team. And there may be different levels of teams. There may be a team with master oversight in a facility and then more local teams, perhaps down to the unit or kitchen level. And one of the things that I think is so exciting about IDDSI is that this is not a single discipline initiative. This initiative brings people from different professions together to solve problems around a common issue. And so it really is a beautiful opportunity for interprofessional collaboration. We recommend that you then develop a calendar of milestones, begin educating stakeholders, and then go into a very important step of mapping the existing products in your facility to the framework. And I'll talk just a little bit more about what that's going to involve in a couple of slides. While you're doing that, industry will be working on label changes, and then there'll be an important clinical application step of making sure that you can map these changes as well to things like assessment protocols and patient education materials. On the IDDSI website, we are sharing a number of resources to support implementation. And within the next week or two, we will be releasing an implementation guide that is a 12-month calendar. And there are 3 target groups for this: people working in food service and catering, people working in industry, and people working in clinical settings. And there'll be individual guidelines for each, or guides for each of those groups, but also a master version that looks like the one shown here on the slide. And so please do keep checking back at the IDDSI website for these kinds of resources. So one of the resources you'll find on the website is the framework itself and the definitions of the characteristics of liquids and foods at each of the IDDSI levels. So I encourage you to read those carefully. And along with that framework document and the definitions, we have other supplementary documents such as testing methods, a statement regarding the available evidence, and very importantly, a frequently asked questions area and resource on the website. So please do consult those FAQs and they will continue to build over time. So let's just take a minute to talk about the measurement, because really the key to having a common definition of a texture is the ability for each of us to measure it and to know with confidence whether an item falls within or outside a particular measurement guideline. Now on this video, I'm showing an example of the IDDSI flow test, which I hope you've encountered already. You can see here we have 4 liquids flowing through a standard 10 milliliter slip tip syringe. And after 10 seconds of flow, you can see that the person has stopped the flow, and you can see 4 different amounts of liquid left behind in these 4 syringes. And this illustrates the 4 levels of thickening on the drinks side of the framework. The flow test is really very simple to do, and it is a valid test. It's very similar to tests that exist in the food industry using something called a posthumous funnel. And we have found that it works really beautifully for delineating levels 1, 2, and 3, the slightly, mildly, and moderately thick levels of thickening. At level 4 and at the top of the level 3 range, you'll see that hardly any liquid will drip through the syringe, and this means that the test has saturated. Now, one thing I'd like to bring to your attention is that you can't just take any syringe. It's really important that you have a syringe with the correct dimensions, or else the measurements won't be valid. And so you need to get a standard 10 milliliter slip tip syringe where the length from the 0 to the 10 milliliter line is 61.5 millimeters. Now, we are beginning to circulate a business card size pocket guide that will help you to check this. And along the left-hand side of that business card, if you've got one already, is a 61.5 millimeter reference line that you can take your syringe and line it up against. We'll be making information available about how you can order these test cards yourself if you feel that that would be useful in your practice. And we've heard about people giving these to families so that they can go home and check. There's also a color bar along the left-hand side so that you could compare the residual fluid in the syringe and know which level that liquid falls into. On the slide, I've listed 4 models of the Becton-Dickinson syringe brand, which is most commonly available in North America, that meet the size specifications. So we really encourage you to make sure that you have a correct syringe. And another tip to check is to put water in the syringe and to see how long it takes for the water to exit the syringe completely. And that should happen in 7 seconds. So it would be a thin liquid at level 0 with nothing left at 10 seconds, but it should be all gone by 7 seconds. And so if you find that the water is exiting faster than that, perhaps the syringe isn't quite right. Maybe the nozzle is too wide. Or if it's taking longer than that, then there might be another explanation. I had a slightly embarrassing example of this last summer when I was doing some teaching, and I took a syringe that I'd been carrying around with me, and I decided to demonstrate this calibration task. And to my horror, 10 milliliters of water took 23 seconds to exit the syringe. And clearly the syringe was dirty and had residue left behind in it that was affecting the flow of the water. So those are, I hope, helpful tips. Now, when you get to the top of level 3 and level 4, we've saturated the range that can be tested using the flow test. And at this point, IDDSI recommends that you move to other types of testing. These are slightly more subjective, but we've provided definitions and guidelines. And so at level 3 and level 4, we recommend using a fork drip test and a spoon tilt test. So on the fork drip test, you're looking at whether or not the liquid falls easily through the prongs of a fork and forms a drip. And you can see on the top left-hand example here, that droplet forming, whereas on the bottom, there's a tail forming, but it's not actively flowing. And that would be a distinction between levels 3 and 4. Spoon tilt testing, similarly, in the top example, you can see that the liquid flows off the spoon, whereas in the lower example, it sort of falls or plops off in a more single bolus that stays together. And so those are useful tests. As we go higher up the food side of the framework, then we need to be able to describe 3 characteristics of the food. One is the particle size. This is extremely important with respect to choking risk. And so at level 5, minced and moist, we've specified that when you apply a fork down onto the food and apply light pressure, just enough to blanch the tip of your thumbnail white, that the food should slip easily between the prongs of the fork and the particles should not be bigger than that gap when you apply that pressure. And that gap just turns out to be 4 millimeters for a standard dinner fork. If you're working with children with dysphagia, because their airways are smaller, we recommend half that size, so 2 millimeters as the particle size for minced and moist. Another characteristic that is really important for the food side is the hardness of the food. And so here you see an illustration of the fork pressure test being used for level 6 soft and bite-sized. And here we would not expect the food to slide through the prongs of the fork, and we wouldn't expect it to break when the fork is applied. However, if the pressure was enough to form a pattern in the food, like a banana, for example, that pattern would stay visible when you remove the fork. And that test has actually been around and entrenched in the British guidelines for some time. I just want to go back actually to emphasize the particle size characteristic at level 6. Here again, this is based on coronial literature about the size of the airway and how large a piece will be if it blocks an adult airway. And we've specified a maximum piece size or bite size here of 1.5 centimeters in the largest dimension, and that's approximately thumbnail sized. Or if you look at a fork or a spoon, then the width of the fork would be approximately that size. So this is turning out to be quite a big issue in implementation. You may work with people who are cognitively intact and able to cut their food themselves, and that you maybe just be able to educate them. But there are many people with dysphagia who would lack the capacity to alter the size of the pieces themselves in a valid and reliable way. And so for those kinds of patients, we recommend that the food should be served in that bite-sized format. And so particularly for things like casseroles, this is bringing up a lot of questions if pieces of food in, for example, an outsourced meal are larger than that, then they would represent a choking risk. And the third dimension for food that the tests will reveal is its stickiness, and that would be with the spoon tilt test. And obviously, foods that are very sticky would be inappropriate for people with dysphagia. So if you're moving into the stage of measuring food properties, mapping the foods on your diets, then we recommend that you download the free IDDSI apps that are available on both the Apple and Android platforms. And in these apps are demonstration examples of videos of all of the testing methods as well as the definitions. I just want to come back and mention again the sort of expected format of a diet prescription that involves texture modification, and to highlight here that there's quite often 3 components to one of these prescriptions, the first being a nutritional specification, followed by a food texture specification, and then a liquid specification. And so we have now developed and formalized abbreviations that will be suitable for computer software that's used in diet ordering. And this is being rolled out in new updates to those kinds of softwares. And to highlight here, just to come back to this idea of a range of textures that would be suitable to include in a diet like this, if a patient had a prescription of level 5 foods and level 2 liquids, then we believe that in the majority of cases, it would also be fine and suitable for that patient to also receive pureed or extremely thick items and liquidized or moderately thick items that fall between those boundaries. And I think this is quite a change in concept and really brings home the message that a diet is rarely just one level. This slide is not in your handout, but it just shows an example of how you might map a particular meal. And let's assume that this patient has a recommendation for level 6 soft and bite-sized foods and slightly thick liquids. If we look at this particular dinner tray, there's one item on the tray, the diced carrots, that would, when tested, fall into level 6 on the framework. There are 2 items, the chopped roast beef and the cottage cheese, that would be classified as level 5. There are 4 items that would test at level 4 on the framework, 2 at level 3, and 1 at level 1. And so this variety of textures coming from those levels between level 6 and level 1 on the framework would be suitable in this conceptualization to serve to a patient with that diet specification. So just as we bring this to a close and to have some time for questions, to remind you that we have an IDDSI website and really encourage you to go there, search through all the tabs. This is a website that evolves quite frequently, and we send out an e-bite about once a month. So please fill out the contact area and make sure you sign up for that. I've mentioned the FAQs that we really ask you to read carefully and digest. And you'll find links to all of our publications through the website. And for those of you who may be working with patients who speak different languages or who are not from an English-speaking country, we are in the process of building translations of key documents. Those will be the framework and descriptors and the testing methods. You can see here on the slide that several of those translations have already been finalized. On the right-hand side, I'm showing here the French translations that were developed for Canadian French as opposed to France French, and we have both of those variations available. So if you are a person who speaks another language and you would be interested in being part of either developing a draft translation or part of the peer review process for validating those translations, please send us an email so that we can get you involved. And so just to wrap up then, I hope that you find this as exciting as we do to see the world moving towards common terminology that will promote safety with respect to diet prescription for people with dysphagia of all ages, all care settings, and across all cultures. And before I take questions, I just want to I give you sort of an early heads up of a really exciting initiative that will be happening in June. June, as you may know, is Dysphagia Awareness Month. And so the National Foundation of Swallowing Disorders is partnering with IDDSI for an initiative. You might know the last year people recorded videos of a thickened liquid challenge. This year, we would like to get people to share recipes and video examples or picture examples of products that they've developed for different levels on the IDDSI framework. We really believe that it's possible for these products to be made in elegant and appetizing ways, such as the example shown on the slide. And we'd like to really get help with this towards building guidance and recipe books and suggestions for people about how food can be modified. And so if you have done this, if you've come up with a way, for example, to make a pureed sandwich, which is a particular challenge, or you have a really good recipe that is a texture other than regular or thin, then please look for more information about this and opportunities to share that with us via social media. And I understand there will be prizes. So with that, we have about 15 minutes for me to try to answer some of your questions.
Thank you. Let me read one of the questions that have come in. Are you recommending doing away with using the more descriptive terminology for liquids like nectar and honey, etc.?
Yes, we are. So nectar and honey were terms that were used in North America. The terms were not necessarily clearly understood, and they weren't measurable by most people. The labels actually referred to specific viscosity ranges, and the measurement of viscosity is complicated and needs skill and equipment that just isn't available. And so we are recommending a transition to the terminology slightly thick, mildly thick, moderately thick, and extremely thick. Nectar will map largely to the mildly thick category, and honey to the moderately thick category.
Okay. As you've been working through this, is another question. Could you talk about your experience in actually rolling this out and what you've seen, the positive and the challenges?
Sure.
And settings that you've rolled this out in and tested it in?
Right. So it's early days. I think that that's important to say. These changes aren't going to happen overnight. IDDSI itself was involved in a pilot implementation project at a hospital in Germany that is described in one of those 4 manuscripts. And I think you'll find that interesting to read through in terms of the consultation with the chef and things like how these diets were going to be ordered and that sort of thing. And for me personally, and I'm aware of local implementations that are at different stages in different facilities. I can tell you in the hospital where I work, there have been some small steps along this path. I know that a syringe is being used for flow testing in the kitchen as a quality assurance mechanism for some of the products that are thickened in-house. And I think that's a huge step in the right direction. I think that when you begin to test liquids and foods, one of the expected things is a stage of shock when people realize that what a level that they assumed something was in isn't actually the case. Or they may become aware of variations in a product that they find alarming. With soups, for example, we're very aware that the flow of a soup may change over time as temperature changes. And so coming to grips with that and deciding where do you want the test to be run? When do you want to be able to stand behind the result? Is that in the kitchen or is that at the point of service to the patient? And how are you going to navigate those differences is a natural step for people to go through. I did some teaching in one facility where scrambled eggs were brought up for practice testing. And we realized, I guess not with entire surprise, but we realized that the eggs actually couldn't be cut, like they didn't break apart at all when a light fork pressure was placed on them because they had become rubbery. That meant that they weren't suitable in level 6 or level 5 of the IDDSI framework. And that was one thing to come to terms with. But it also meant that, in fact, they weren't suitable under the old terminology either for anything other than a regular diet in that particular state. And that was something for that facility to come to terms with. So I think you will come across these challenges. We're very aware that sandwiches and bread are something that have been included as an addition to diets a lot. And our guidance at the moment is just to say that bread and sandwiches really are a huge cause of choking. And so this really comes back to clinical practice. What methods are we using to decide whether a patient really does have a choking risk? And if you're not certain, then bread is something that if you're being conservative and you want to limit risk, bread should not be included on that person's diet. And that is going to take some change in implementation. So those, I think, are the things we're hearing a lot about as people come to terms with those. Another change I'm aware of in our facility was the decision to stop sending thickener in cups on the tray as an item that could be added as needed at the bedside. It was recognized as a risk that people wouldn't necessarily know what it was. They might mistake it for food. And in fact, there was a coroner's case in the United Kingdom where a patient choked to death from ingesting dry thickener powder, which then formed a nasty mucus plug in their throat and caused a choking death. So I think those are examples of the awareness that comes as you enter that stage of mapping the foods and liquids in your diets.
So, that's really interesting about the soup example to me, because, so did you land somewhere when it came to the soup? Is it when it's prepared or when it's delivered to
the patient? I actually don't know at the corporate level where things are landing. I know for me personally that the most important measurement is at the point of service.
Mm-hmm.
I think the beautiful thing about the flow test is that end users can be empowered to do it. Ed, you'd asked me to perhaps comment on pediatrics and families with children with dysphagia. The truth is that the historical diets really have not served that population well. And we are hearing all sorts of wonderful creative examples where making parents aware of the testing methods is opening up and empowering families to be creative with variety of food, but giving them confidence. So if we say for your child, we really think a slightly thick liquid is the right level, then they have a way to go home and test it and not necessarily just stick to a commercially available product, but go to the grocery store and find things that are already in that thickness level. The temperature thing is also really important with the pediatric population. I'm aware of some great work being done in children's hospitals looking at formula, which has to be heated often to a serving temperature. But if a baby is slow to complete a feed, the consistency of that formula may change dramatically from the beginning to the end of a feeding session. And so it may in fact be appropriate to make smaller batches and have them heated at points during that session, or to have shorter feeding session targets to keep within the target range.
Okay. Here is another question. Do you predict slightly thick to be a liquid level available more commercially?
Wow. I sort of wish I had a crystal ball. I think the slightly thick level is a really exciting level. We developed it because pediatric clinicians told us that it was a level that they often recommend. This is a fluid that is still thin enough that you can express it through a nipple or drink it through a straw without excessive effort, but it's not as thin, and it's not as thick as what we've called nectar or mildly thick. So it's in between. And I think clinically for some years, there's been an interest in commercially available drinks that happen to be a bit thicker than water. Things like yogurt drinks may fall into this level. And the truth is, we have no research at this point to tell us whether this is an effective level of thickening for managing aspiration risk, either in infants or in any other age sector of the dysphagia population. So I think the first thing is we need more information about the physiology of swallowing this level. That's work that some of us are undertaking. I think it would be lovely to see it become part of our assessment protocols as a step before we go all the way to mildly thick. I have a personal bias to thicken as little as possible when thickening is needed. And I think that we may see it become a level that is offered, but that will take time.
Okay. Here's another question. Has IDDSI collaborated with modified barium swallow P standards, and how will that affect SLP protocols with video swallows?
It's a great question.
Okay.
So what we have done is we have in the United States, we have arranged for flow testing of the Veribar products that are available from Bracco. And on our website in the resources section is a short 2 or 3 page document that tells you how the Veribar products map to the IDDSI framework. One of the things that is challenging about barium is that it's a pharmaceutical product, and so changing the label of a pharmaceutical product is a very, very big deal and would require new safety trials before the FDA would approve a change in labeling. So it's different than changing the label of a food, and we don't expect that to happen in the near future. So the best we could do is provide a document that shows the mapping for you. And at the moment, the Bracco Veribar products map nicely from nectar to mildly thick and the thin honey to moderately thick. There isn't at the moment existing barium product that falls into the slightly thick category, and so that is something that will need to be developed. And for those people not in the United States, then this is sort of a pet project of my lab, is to make recipes available to guide people when you're making barium from other brands. And so you can go there for suggestions on how to prepare those. Will it then flow into protocols? I hope so. I hope that down the road we will start to see the IDDSI levels becoming the graded steps of texture modification that are tested in standard assessment protocols.
Okay. So there's about a dozen questions. I'm going to go through some more of them.
Okay.
What about mixed consistency foods? For example, oatmeal with milk, vegetable soup, chunky applesauce, or stage 3 baby foods?
Right. So the issue with mixed consistency foods is that they're particularly challenging for people with dysphagia to handle. And so any mixed consistency where the fluid flows actively away from the solid portion, we believe falls into level 7 as a regular diet consistency item that is not suitable for people with dysphagia as a rule. On the framework, we do have a level called transitional foods. It's a sidebar that represents foods that you may begin to try as you're progressing a patient from a more restricted level to a less restricted level. And these are products that change consistency very rapidly in the mouth. So ice chips that melt would be an example. And so there are testing methods for those, but mixed or two-phase consistencies are reserved for level 7 on the framework.
Okay. Are products like powdered thickeners going to be usable with this new framework?
Yes, absolutely. The products with powdered thickeners are going to continue to be usable. This is part of the industry relabeling that will happen. So we're aware that that most of the manufacturers went out and tested their products immediately, and that in some cases, there are some slight reformulations of the amounts of thickener that are being recommended in order to achieve values on the IDDSI framework that fall within each level.
Okay. Here's a question from someone from Brazil, and they're wondering if you know if Nestle or other companies are planning to bring their products to South America.
I don't know that for sure. I'll actually be in Brazil next week, partly speaking on this, and there's a Brazilian Portuguese translation of IDDSI that is needing peer review and finalization. I'm aware that Nestle is one of the companies that does provide some products already in some regions of South America, but I don't know the plans for broader marketing.
Okay. How do we manage powder thickener quantity recommendations that thicken differently depending on the liquids used, such as water versus milk?
Oh, thank you for this question. I think this is a perfect question for illustrating the value of IDDSI. It's a myth that you can add the same amount of thickener to different liquids and get an equivalent product out the other end. So a thickener will interact with things like the protein in milk or the acid in a juice, and that will affect how the thickening bonds are formed and how they evolve over time. And so what's so beautiful about the IDDSI testing methods is that doesn't matter, because what matters is that you run the test and you know how thick the product is. So that if you've taken a standard recipe for 1 scoop of thickener to your liquid and you run the test and you find that it's not thick enough, then next time you can add a little bit less thickener or more thickener. Or if it's too thick at the time of serving, then maybe you can experiment with slight reductions in your thickener recipe so that you can reliably hit the same range every time.
Okay, good. So this question is, I think it's a great question. Besides the master implementation guide, will there be resources for clinicians to show to their facility directors to try to start the implementation process and buy-in?
Absolutely. So many of these are already available on the website, and there are more often in development. One of the things we have developed is a standard PowerPoint presentation. In fact, there's more than one that are short, sort of key message presentations that you could use in educating stakeholders. There are posters that are available that you can download and print. The business cards that I mentioned, the pocket guide references will be available. The we're making a lot of videos of testing available, and the apps are available. And all the documents are available. So yes, it's a growing resource area, but we hope that those will really be useful for you. IDDSI, in addition to this webinar that the NFOSD is hosting, is also doing its own webinar series at the moment. We've done one recently on pediatric implementation, and there's one coming up on implementation in long-term care, where champions who've made some of those early implementation success stories are sharing the lessons they've learned. So those are also recorded and available on the website for you to watch and use.
Let me ask one last question, and I'm not sure I understand the question, but
Okay.
I'll read it verbatim. What about the supplements, liquid versus pudding?
Okay. So nutritional supplements are a particularly challenging thing to thicken because of the high protein content. So again, the decision about the target texture for a patient would depend on the swallowing assessment. The need for supplements would come from the nutritional side. And then using the IDDSI testing methods, you would decide whether a pudding that was already commercially available pudding supplement was the right thing to choose, or whether you would be working with trying to thicken the liquid supplements. And again, that's where the flow test is useful. I will say that those supplements can be challenging in terms of the time stability of their thickening. So it might be a case where you want to do some repeated testing and test at the point of service to make sure that they're the appropriate consistency.
One last question. Is there a similar awareness campaign occurring among dietitians?
Absolutely. So there's a long history of, particularly in North America, of ASHA and the Dietitians Association not necessarily seeing eye to eye on dysphagia diets. One of the things that's exciting about IDDSI is that both the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and the American Speech Language Hearing Association have endorsed IDDSI. On the dietitian side, the diet manual is being rewritten to be IDDSI aligned, and I believe that'll be released quite soon. And there's a big educational platform being developed within their organization. There are also other associations that are coming on board to do with food service. And so this is really moving forward as something relevant for a wide variety of professions to be collaborating on.
Dr. Steele, I want to thank you for volunteering your time tonight, for providing the awareness that this, as this will help anyone with a swallowing disorder. And, thank you for your dedication to helping this population. It's very, very moving to me.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure and really an honor to be part of this. And if there are questions that weren't answered, I'll do my best to answer those offline.
Okay. I have one closing slide. If that could be put up, please, and then we will wrap up for the evening. So,
Great.
In closing, I just want to thank everyone for attending and for taking an interest in this. If, as Dr. Steele said, if you had a question that was asked and wasn't answered, or wasn't answered to the depth you were hoping for, send it to info@nfosc.com, and we'll collect those and pass those on to Dr. Steele. And that we hope that you will join us for our next webinar. So please stay tuned. And with that, I'm going to sign off, and thank you once again, Dr. Steele, for your time and information tonight.
Thank you, Ed, and good night, everybody.